Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Global Reads. If this is your first time, welcome to one of the series of events that we run here at AKFC, which we have every now and then when we get to invite a discussant and an author to be able to have an insightful conversation. So I want to thank everyone who has joined us today, all of us who have joined us in person, and as well to everyone who is joining us virtually. We thank you for your participation, especially to those who are in the room. Despite what Ottawa had to offer in terms of the weather, we still appreciate you taking the time out to be with us here today. We're also delighted to have both of our esteemed speakers with us in person. Just before we get started, I'd like to share a few housekeeping information for us. Just particularly as we go on in today's conversation, there will be a bit of time for us to have Q&A. So as the conversation is unfolding with the discussant and the author, please make sure to keep in mind any questions or thoughts or anything you want to probe further, and then we'll have a bit of time to take those questions. And then also, if you're joining us online, you can use the Q&A function to put in your questions there. And then I just want to lastly encourage those of us in the room to not leave here without making a connection, especially if you haven't, spoken to people or seen them in a while. We also use these events and opportunities like this to build our networks with one another. So please don't be in a rush to leave. Make a connection before you head out. So I'll quickly turn it over to Khalil Sharif, who is the CEO here at Aga Khan Foundation Canada, to give us a few remarks. So please join me in welcoming Khalil.
Thank you, Uju. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate. It's a great delight to welcome you to this most recent episode of Global Reads. Some of you have been here maybe for everyone. Henry, maybe. It's lovely to see both old friends and new. We are here at the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate, which is in Ottawa.
Challenges, and of course we can't ignore those challenges. I think it's really important to correct those misperceptions that everything is terrible all the time.
So this is a book about trying to identify success stories. How do you even go about doing a book like this? What's your methodology? What's your kind of way of approaching it?
Well, this was a really big challenge. As I mentioned, it was the beginning of the pandemic. I wasn't going to be able to do the type of work that I'm used to doing, which involves travel, talking to people, interviews, surveys. And so I thought that one way to approach this was through using major international metrics. And so to see if this book was even going to be possible, the first thing that I did was sit down and think about, okay, what are some of the most important things that we can think about from the perspective of people living a full life? So economic development, governance, gender equality, public health, and climate. Those were the things that I wanted to look at. And so I went to look for reputable sources of data where I could get comparable statistics country to country to try to identify high performers. And so this was an exercise. I spent about a week with a chaotic spreadsheet just trying to look at whether there was going to be enough here for me to hang my hat on. And as I shown in the book, for each chapter, I had numerous cases that I could select from of countries that were doing well on these particular metrics. So within the confines of the time that I was writing this, that was the methodology I used.
And there are a lot of positive stories. You talk about the fact that since 1990, poverty rates have declined in Africa due to rapid economic growth. Governance has improved. There's been an increase in the number of democratic elections, an increase in the protection of civil liberties. The percentage of women elected to national legislatures has doubled. The rate of malaria has plummeted. These are things that a lot of, I would say, the general public, particularly in North America, couldn't even fathom, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I see this with the perceptions of my students have not changed in the decade that I've been teaching, even though things materially have improved. I can tell you that from the time that I started traveling to various African countries in the early 2000s, my mother's anxiety about these travels has not decreased because of her perception of how things are. And so I think that, our perceptions belie the reality of improvement, which is not to say that there are not still challenges, but the improvement is there. And I think that if we immediately dismiss or lose sight of the improvements, then that can lead to a sense of despair or nihilism. And so that was a big goal for me with writing this book, was to highlight those.
When it comes to economic growth, you highlight two countries. You look at Seychelles and you look at Gabon. Why those two countries?
Well, I toyed with a few different economic indicators for choosing the countries that had the highest economic performance. And no matter which indicators I chose, those two were always among the top 5 countries in Africa. And so I knew that those choices were likely going to be a bit controversial. Seychelles, as a small island nation, is often singled out as being exceptional and not really comparable to other places. And Gabon has its share of issues, right? So this is not a stellar performer in a lot of other ways. So this is perhaps a suggestion that we also need to think about what the economic metrics are picking up. But I thought if these countries are coming out at the top of all of these different economic metrics, it's worthwhile to investigate why. And I also, if I can just sort of take a little bit of a turn here and get up on a different soapbox. In the field of African politics, there's also a tendency to focus on a small collection of countries, and a lot of the studies focus on them. So South Africa gets a lot of attention, Tanzania gets a lot of attention, Ghana gets a lot of attention. And so I don't think it's necessarily fair to dismiss a country like Seychelles because it's small. So I wanted to focus on countries that get less attention otherwise. And recognizing that perhaps this selection would be a bit controversial, I thought it's still worthwhile to investigate why Seychelles does so well when other island nations, some do not, why Gabon has been doing well compared to its regional neighbors, which have worse challenges related to some of the ones that Gabon has as well.
One thing that you argue, or a couple things you argue that leadership matters. Mm-hmm. Policy matters, policy decisions. And you cite the fact that I think it was in 2009, Ali Bongo, who takes over from his autocratic father Omar, moves the country in a different direction. He pivots, and it results in a certain measure of success for Gabon. Could you elaborate on that? Like, what happened in 2009? What did Ali Bongo do that changed the direction, changed the course of his country?
Yeah, so my argument here is that up until 2009, the Bongo dynasty in Gabon was treating the economy really similarly to the way that some of its neighbors were. And in terms of the heavy reliance on oil and the inability to redistribute the rents from oil to the rest of the economy and the rest of the population. So when Ali Bongo took over from his father in, what we must call a fraudulent election, he was elected in a much more precarious position than his father was. And he also started to make some changes in terms of intentionally diversifying the economy. So he started to focus more on some of the other extractive sectors, including some other minerals and timber. He also started working with the United Nations to get money to protect some of the forested areas of Gabon, which is a really clever way to monetize some of those resources without having to export them. And he really did a lot more than his father did in terms of investing in other sectors of the economy, in a way that has made the Gabonese economy more resilient to the decline of oil production than in some of the neighboring countries. Now, part of my argument in this chapter is that he didn't do this just because he was a better leader than his father, but that the fact that he was in a more precarious position politically meant that he had to sort of move some things around to not have all of the rents, all of the resources concentrated around oil. And that's not the first time in the book that precarity of leaders is important in terms of them making some of these more prudent decisions.
Yeah, and his position indeed was precarious because he lost power. He lost power. He was overthrown in 2023.
Yes, he was ousted. He was ousted in a coup shortly after the book went to print. Like, if I could have added that in, it would have really underscored my point that he was in a precarious position.
What does it mean? What does that mean, though? Has Gabon continued along that path?
It's too soon to tell. I think that, it's going to be important to see what happens with the leadership of Gabon moving forward. Gabon has unfortunately been in a position with a number of other West African and Central African countries of experiencing coups recently, and I think everybody is waiting to see whether those military governments are going to hand over control back to civilians. So in terms of Gabon, it's too soon to see whether some of those policies will remain in place. But I unfortunately didn't have a crystal ball when I was writing this chapter.
You say that Seychelles has been fortunate because it's managed to avoid what you call the resource curse.
Yes.
What is the resource curse? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so the resource curse is a phenomenon where countries that have a lot of natural resource wealth wind up with worse governments and worse economies. There's an economic component and a political component. The economic component is that when you have a lot of something like oil, you wind up pouring all your resources into developing that sector to the neglect of the rest of the economy. And there's some more complicated components in terms of what that does to your currency and the inability to develop a manufacturing sector. But suffice it to say that focusing too much of your time and attention on one sector of the economy means that the rest of it withers. In terms of politics, the political side of the resource curse is that when you can get a lot of money from things like developing your oil fields, that makes gaining power a really valuable resource for politicians. So countries with natural resource wealth also tend to have higher rates of corruption and worse governance overall, in part because gaining power is a really great way to line your pockets with rents from the oil or other type of mineral sector.
And you say that the natural resources that Seychelles has, they weren't of high enough value to trigger what you call a resource curse behavior.
Yeah.
And those resources are coconuts and tuna.
Yes. Yeah, coconuts and tuna don't generate the same type of enticement as something like oil or gold or some of these other high-value minerals.
Seychelles also made the decision to focus on tourism. Can you tell us a bit about that? Elaborate on that?
Yeah.
Luxury tourism.
This was a really clever move, I think, because for a country that's really small, if you want to attract tourism, you can't attract too many tourists because that's going to damage the ecosystem, especially when you're a small island nation. So Seychelles made a decision quite early on to put resources into a luxury tourism sector to try to build out Seychelles as a destination for wealthy people from Africa, from Arab countries, and from Europe. And so in doing so, they were able to limit the number of people coming to the island, but maximize the revenue from each individual visitor. In doing this, they also set up direct flights from the UK to try to establish some of those connections. And so there was a really heavy policy side of this, where the government spent a lot of resources to establish this as being a high-end tourism sector.
Let's go to good governance, because you cite two countries as being countries that we need to look to for hope. And that's Botswana and also Mauritius. And I was particularly interested in Botswana because Botswana, of course, has diamonds, but it has managed to channel that revenue from diamonds into things like healthcare, into things like education. Can you tell us about those two cases of Botswana and Mauritius?
Yes. So in the chapter on governance, part of what I'm looking at is the quality of government in a country. And I explicitly didn't want to look at something like level of democracy, because you can have a democracy that governs very poorly. You can also have countries that are more autocratic but practice good governance, although that's a bit less common. So I was looking at indicators of governance, which include democratic components like being able to hold leaders accountable and being able to exercise free speech and association, but also looks at the way that the government uses its resources in terms of service delivery and things like that. So two standout countries among a group of standout countries were Mauritius and Botswana. So Botswana has had democratic institutions since it gained its independence in 1964, which is unusual on the African continent. And while the ruling party has not changed, by most measures, the elections in Botswana are free and fair, and the ruling party has done an excellent job of investing in public service delivery. So what else do you want to know about?
Well, I wanted to know about Mauritius because the
Okay.
Mauritius situation is one in which you had almost a kind of a visionary leader who understood the need for unity, who understood the need for dialogue between communities, and that adopting that approach would result in a certain kind of, well, would result in peace.
Yes, and I'm going to ask you to interrupt me if I start going into lecture mode, because now you're inviting me to sort of talk about this in a lecture style way. But okay, so in Mauritius, one of the really common things that happened upon independence for many African countries is that there would be an inaugural democratic election, and then the person who won those elections would quite quickly then transition to a single-party state or some other form of authoritarianism. And in Mauritius, it seemed like this was a distinct possibility. So the first president of Mauritius was elected from the majority ethnic group in the country, which is typically a recipe for trying to consolidate power and having some base of legitimacy in your ethnic group and trying to use that base of legitimacy to consolidate power and close the political system. Ultimately, he decided that this was not the route to take, and he explicitly wanted to build a party system that was going to require that parties draw support from multiple ethnic groups within Mauritius. This was a really uncommon thing to do at the time.
How do you account for that? Like, how do you account for his decision to make that choice?
You know, I think it's a combination of the circumstances and the personality. I do think that leadership, the personality of leaders is quite important, although it's really hard to measure, especially in retrospect, when we can't do, a personality assessment of these people in contemporary terms. But there are a lot of his writings where he focuses explicitly on the importance of unity in Mauritius. He, however, was not alone as being an inaugural African president who talked about unity. But one of the distinctions is this is where precarity comes back in. Though he was from the largest ethnic group within Mauritius, the way the institutions were set up, that single group would not give him enough votes to be able to govern. So Mauritius developed a parliamentary system where you have to have over 50% of the legislature in order to retain your power. And the group he was from did not have 50%. So he knew he was going to have to draw support from multiple groups. And in what I think is a quite ingenious move, set up the party system so that all parties would have to do the same thing. So I think that part of it was perhaps personality and a commitment to pluralism, but it was also the circumstances that he was not going to be able to draw enough support to retain power without making that kind of move.
Let's talk about public health. And can I quote from your book here?
Please.
Because you say, where is it here? You say, according to the World Bank, infant mortality in Africa has dropped by 47%, and life expectancy has increased by 23% since 1990. These improved statistics are directly related to improved public health, with endemic diseases like malaria decreasing by 37%, and epidemic scale diseases like HIV/AIDS decreasing by 71% over 2000 to 2019. And you look at two countries here, Guinea-Bissau and Malawi. Can you paint the picture of those two countries for us?
Yeah, so these are among the poorest countries on the continent, and both countries that have struggled with endemic malaria for decades. I was shocked to see that Guinea-Bissau was one of the countries that had the largest decreases in malaria.
Why?
Well, Guinea-Bissau is not usually held up as a success story about just about anything. It's a country that has struggled with governance. It is a country that has struggled with its economy. It's very small. It doesn't wind up in the news very often for much of anything. And so it was really surprising to me that this country was among the top. So I will say I was looking at countries that started with a very high malaria rate and then looked at the amount of decrease since 1990.
I should say that there was a time in the 1960s and the 1970s that Guinea-Bissau was an inspiration, right, for countries around the world. Like if people remember, the leader, Amilcar Cabral, was someone who influenced folks, around the world, who had an impact on, some of the leaders of the civil rights movement, right, who looked to his writings like they would have looked to the writings of someone like a Frantz Fanon. Guinea-Bissau was on the upswing for a while, and things, well, to quote Chinua Achebe, they fell apart.
Yeah, this is a really unfortunate reality for a lot of countries, particularly in West and Central Africa, that initially promising governments post-independence ultimately dissolved into authoritarianism and civil conflict. And there were a lot of inspirational leaders that came from that region that ultimately, after their tenure was complete, the countries did not perform well on a lot of these indicators.
Yeah, Cabral, of course, was assassinated.
Right.
Yeah.
But Guinea-Bissau has made astounding strides in terms of malaria reduction. And so in this chapter, so what I did here, because public health is not my area of expertise, I went and looked to the public health literature and the medical literature for case studies of anything that anybody was publishing about malaria reduction in any of these countries.
And just for the record, malaria kills, I think the number is 386,000 people every single year on the continent.
It's shocking. It's shocking. And most of them are children, which is, the most heart-wrenching part of it. But one of the things that I found fascinating about the Guinea-Bissau case is that a lot of these articles that were talking about their approach to malaria reduction in Guinea-Bissau focused heavily on the role of community volunteers in distributing things like bed nets. And Guinea-Bissau has one of the highest uptake rates for bed net usages on the continent. And part of the argument that I make in the chapter is that this is because the messaging about bed nets has come from these trusted members of the community. And
I think you call it endogenous institutions?
Yes, so you could think about this as endogenous, meaning sort of coming from within.
Yeah.
But there are pre-existing community organizations that partnered with health organizations to be able to talk to people about why the bed nets are important, what they are for, why you should use them as a bed net and not a fishing net or other things like that. And as a result, the levels of trust in these community organizations that were doing this work meant that people were actually carrying out the practices. And you can see this then in the decline in the malaria rates over the studies that I cite, as well as in the international statistics.
What's the lesson there?
I think a big part of the lesson there is that with international development, it's often done in a top-down manner. And plans are constructed in Ottawa, in Washington, D.C., in some of these other major centers of power, and then distributed to different places around the world. And I think that it's really important to engage with community organizations on the ground in the places where development organizations work. And in the places where you do have more community engagement, you do use the local institutions of governance that people trust, that you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck out of your development dollars.
Can you tell us about the Malawi situation?
Yeah, the Malawi situation was a little bit harder to disentangle what was going on. Ultimately, the trust in the government was and the trust in the agencies that were carrying out the malaria projects, it was not as obvious as in the case of Guinea-Bissau, what was happening. But Malawi had a similar type of program where there were community outreach volunteers that were engaging with communities to do things like bed net distribution, spraying pesticides to try to get rid of the mosquitoes and things like that. So you had similar types of structures in place, although I will say it was harder to figure out the Malawi case than the Guinea-Bissau case, where the literature I was reading was pretty unanimous that these community groups were doing the work.
Chapter 5 is called City Planning for Climate Adaptation. Climate change, really one of the major challenges of the 21st century. You focus here on cities. You focus here on the city of Lagos in Nigeria and the city of Durban in South Africa. And you point to the importance of having strong, even inspirational leaders who are willing to take very clear stances when it comes to addressing climate change. Can you tell us about those two leaders in particular? Deborah Roberts, I think it was, in Durban, and Falosha, if I remember correctly, who was the governor of Lagos State in Nigeria.
Yeah, so in this chapter, I chose to focus on cities instead of countries, in part because municipalities have a massive role to play in terms of climate adaptation and mitigation, and also because it can be easier to see what's going on at the city level as opposed to a country level when it comes to things like climate adaptation. So what stood out in these two cases were a couple of things. One was the leadership. So Deborah Roberts in Durban is a civil servant who has worked tirelessly to try to integrate climate adaptation and mitigation planning into the municipal planning for Durban. And this is something that she has tried to do across multiple different organizations within the city, and has had resounding success in sort of recruiting other civil servants to the cause. But one important thing that I want to highlight here is that in both cases, part of what led to these government officials being taken seriously was really dramatic climate events. So there was massive flooding in both Durban and Lagos that was clearly related to climate change. That was a bit of a wake-up call for the municipalities in terms of their need to deal with these things urgently. And in both cases, but particularly the Durban case, I argue that those events were pivotal in terms of people like Deborah Roberts and the governor of Lagos being able to put policies in place that were going to be funded and that people were going to pay attention to.
It's hard to believe that the genocide in Rwanda was 30 years ago this year, right? 1994. As it happens, I was in class with students, and I'm not name dropping, but I'm just going to tell this story. I was telling the students that they were asking me about a significant interview that I did, and years ago I was hosting this current affairs program called The Current here in Canada, and I happened to interview Bill Clinton, and I asked Bill Clinton what was his biggest regret during his presidency, and he said his biggest regret was his failure to address the situation in Rwanda, the fact that he did not act, and he felt responsible for some of the hundreds of thousands of people who were slaughtered in a very short period of time, like in about a month in Rwanda. We know that the country has changed remarkably over the last 30 years. I've had friends who've recently gone to Rwanda, and they're amazed at just the changes that have taken place in the country. One of the changes has been to the role of women and the active role that women are playing in that society. Can you talk a little bit about gender equality? Because you identify Rwanda and also Senegal as being countries that are really leaders when it comes to gender equality on the continent.
Yeah, and this is particularly true in terms of women's political representation. Both countries have very strong quotas for women's legislative representation, which I'm not sure what it is after the most recent election, but it hovers just under 50% in Senegal and over 60% in Rwanda. And so in both countries, there are quotas for this, but then part of the question is, why do countries decide to design quotas that are so strong and then actually respect them? Because there are a lot of countries that have quotas for women's representation that are weak or unenforced. So in the Rwandan case, a lot of scholars who've looked very closely at this trace this back to the aftermath of the genocide, where women were, first of all, viewed as being less complicit and less responsible in the atrocities of genocide, and also as being particularly victimized during the genocide. And many international organizations and also communities within Rwanda looked to women to rebuild the society after the genocide. There's also some statistics which it's a little bit hard to know how accurate there are about the gender imbalance in Rwanda after the genocide because men were killed at such a disproportionate rate. So women were really looked to as leaders for rebuilding the society and had more credibility in terms of designing new institutions and the peace and reconciliation process because they were perceived as not having been combatants. So Kagame Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, is a controversial leader for a lot of reasons. But one of the things that he has been unfailingly dedicated to is including women in the leadership of the political party and supporting women in the legislature. So,
And what difference is that making? How is that affecting, the discourse? How is that affecting policies that are made in the country?
So we can see that there are both symbolic effects and material effects of having more women in the legislature. There have been dramatic improvements to issues around things like maternal health care and women's education in Rwanda, which can be traced back to pieces of
legislation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Legislation that have come out of the legislature that have been spearheaded by women in the legislature. We can also see this in terms of the symbolic effects of thinking that women have a place in public life, that women have a excuse me, I shouldn't cough that direction. Please excuse
No,
me.
sorry. Normally on radio, we'd start talking about the weather, so I can give you a weather update at this point. It's snowing. Okay, they call this ragging the puck. We're in a hockey country, so now it's time for me to rag the puck, and I'll just start name dropping, like Dave Keon. This looks like a Dave Keon kind of audio. Am I correct? Are you familiar with Dave? Does Dave Keon mean anything to you? Right, the former, the captain of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Really, Dave Keon? Right? Wasn't Dave Keon? Dave Keon, I think, was from Northern Ontario. Wasn't he from Rouyn-Noranda, if I remember correctly? I think so. Yeah, he was from. Rwanda, that's correct. That's right. Northern Rwanda in Noranda. That's correct.
Oh, no, I don't, thank you.
We're
No,
ready?
there's
We're
something
back?
in my throat. Yes.
Okay. I was going to start talking
Maybe.
Syracuse basketball, like Jim Boeheim. Talk about Jim
excuse
Boeheim.
me while I start coughing again.
Yeah.
But yes, so the symbolic effects are that it makes a huge difference in terms of people accepting women in positions of government and power.
Yeah.
Oh.
And Senegal, can you talk about the Senegal situation?
Senegal is much different from Rwanda. It has a much different history, no history of civil conflict. And stronger democratic institutions, but also instituted a really strong women's quota under Abdoulaye Wade. And so, the women's civil society movement in Senegal was really instrumental in terms of lobbying Wade for establishing the quota, and also delivered a lot of votes because of it. But women's civil society organizing in Senegal was part of what propelled women there. And we have also seen in Senegal, after the establishment of the quota, an increase in women's political participation, their voting rates, and some other symbolic effects in terms of accepting women in positions of power.
What surprised you as you went on this journey of yours trying to find, or identify success stories in Africa?
I was worried at the outset that it was going to be the same three countries over and over again. And I think that's because, the same small selection of countries tends to get a lot of attention in international media and in scholarship. So I was surprised that for each topic, I had a choice. There was a whole group of countries that I could select from. So that was a pleasant surprise.
So the problem isn't, or I guess maybe I'll come at it this way. There have always been success. The success stories have always been there, but perhaps it's the way in which we see, or what we look at, or what we choose to look at.
Yeah, I think that this is part of the human disposition. We discount the good things that happen to us, and we focus on the negative things that happen to us. That's true in international development. It's true in comparative politics. It's true, I think, especially in academia. We have a tendency to focus on bad things and identify problems. We're very good at identifying problems in academia.
It doesn't happen in news, thank God.
No, just
Yeah.
all good stories all of the time.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
public broadcasting.
Indeed,
It's why everybody loves it.
Indeed, indeed. Can you talk also about some of your takeaways? You know, some of the things that you learn and that you want readers to take away from reading your book.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of my goal here, I've already talked about ad nauseum, is the focusing on successes and talking about how success doesn't have to be miraculous and it doesn't have to be perfect. We can talk about progress rather than perfection. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. But I think, you know, the other thing is that in each of the chapters, I try to disentangle the causes of what's going on to produce successes. Some of these things are structural. Those aren't things that you can really change. Thank you. Sure. So some of the things are structural and might not be possible to change. Some of them are policy. That's imminently changeable. So I think trying to disentangle what are the conditions that we're stuck with and what are the things that can actually be altered is really important in terms of determining what's reproducible over time.
You know, I think we're living at a time where it's important for us, as particularly I think as educators, to talk about possibility, to talk about this notion that another world is possible. We were, like, before we came on stage, we were recounting how, you know, we're slightly different generations, right? But when my first year of university, there was still the sense that we had, my generation had, that we could change the world, right? That we could participate, that we had agency, we had power. You know, my first year of university, the Berlin Wall came down. The next year, Nelson Mandela, you know, comes out of jail. And so we actually thought that we were participating in this kind of grand transformation. You talk about the fact that you came of age when Barack Obama came to power in the United States. And that was what, just 15 years ago, 16 years ago. Again, there was that sense that things could change. Can you tell us, you know, just the importance of instilling this notion amongst this generation that in spite of the despair that many of them feel, and they do feel that about climate change, that, you know, success is possible on the continent of Africa?
Yeah, you know, I worry about nihilism. And I think a lot of the students that I interact with are experiencing that despair and experiencing that sense of nihilism. And so students, teenagers and 20-somethings today have experienced so many traumatic catastrophes over the past 8 years that it's hard to look to the future and see something positive. COVID, Trump, right? The climate catastrophe, all of these things are happening simultaneously. Oh no, it's coming back. And you know, I think, so seeing this and experiencing this with my students and experiencing it myself as an educator and, you know, as a human makes me think that it's really important to also be solutions oriented.
Yeah. I think at this time, I'd like to invite commentary, or at least questions. I think we're at that time. Yeah, I think it's what, quarter to 7. So if you have a question or a comment, you can just go to the microphone, or can you go to the microphone? Is that okay? You'll go to them, or they'll go to the microphone. So please pose your question or make your comment, please.
Thanks so much for having written this book and making, you know, these positive stories of things falling into place rather than falling apart. I think twice I've heard you talk about investments in education. I'm wondering, in the successful countries, is there more of an emphasis on education, and particularly for women?
Yeah, so this comes into the metrics in a few ways. So in measures of economic development, especially something like the Human Development Index, that takes education into consideration. So the countries that are performing better are also countries that have higher aggregate education. Also in the governance indicators, one of the things they look at is spending on things like education. So that absolutely falls into it. And when we're looking at some of the other policy arenas where governments are doing well, a lot of that invariably includes a focus on education. I think that that's absolutely integral to a lot of the different things that I talk about in the book.
Yes, sir.
Thank you again for your presentation. It's very insightful and glad to see that the positive aspects are outlined. My personal field is cultural heritage and natural heritage. And there's a recent study in Nature about 2 or 3 years ago that showed that 350 sites around the coast of Africa were threatened by rising sea levels or aggressive sea levels. And a lot of that, of course, is caused by climate change. And also you're seeing what's happening with South Africa with that diminishment of water availability and other aspects. At the same time, I see 2 other elements. I see things like the Great Green Wall, very ambitious. Usually, there's political issues, there's security issues as well, but it can make a difference in terms of both enabling people to have sustainable livelihoods, be able to retain the nutrients in the soil of that land. I think it's really important if that's possible to occur. And the other is loss and damage. All this discussion we've been having, it's a discussion now. But that being said, what happens moving forward? If there are going to be these funds, if there are going to be these revenues, how do you look at it from a national, regional, municipal standpoint? Because to me, that also represents opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's really unfortunate that we have to get to a point of crisis before action becomes more possible. But I think that part of what we're seeing right now is that a lot of communities are at a point of crisis, and there is starting to be more action at the international level. So there are things like the Climate Fund that is going to hopefully enable communities to adapt and become resilient to climate change. There's a lot, I think, industry is finally starting to focus on a green energy transition, which is not going to it's not going to stop the climate from changing, but will potentially stem the worst of it. So, this is an area where I also, it's easy to get discouraged, but I think that there are bright spots in terms of major institutions as well as industries starting to take it seriously. And I think that, climate change is a structural problem that requires structural solutions.
Mm-hmm. Right over here, sir. Oh, ma'am. Okay.
Hi, I wanted to start by thanking you for writing the book and the discussion. I actually have a question about the Rwandan bill that just passed in the UK. And
I'm sorry, the what bill?
The Rwanda bill.
Oh, uh-huh.
Forgive my accent.
Mm-hmm.
And it talks about, it's basically allowing a mechanism where illegal immigrants to the UK can be sent to Rwanda, and they could then either decide to stay or move somewhere else, but they cannot go back to the UK. And it's gone through many, many different obstacles, at all levels of the legislature. But I'd like to know what your take is on the symbolism of the UK saying immigrants will now be sent to Rwanda. Are we saying Rwanda is, or by extension Africa, is a dumping ground? Or are we saying there are opportunities to build good and safe lives there? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of similar to what the United States has been doing too, in terms of trying to push immigrants back down into Central and South America. And, I think that probably the PR component would be, oh, well, it's a safe and stable place with an economy that's doing well. But I think that the reality is treating Rwanda and Africa as a dumping ground. And I think really, it's unfortunate. It's deeply unfortunate. I think immigrants are not likely to find it easy to do well landing in Rwanda if they are not from there, even as a country that is stable and with a thriving economy. If you don't have the language skills, if you don't have the social network, if you don't have a support system, what are you going to do? I mean, I think that all of these policies of sending immigrants back to other countries and other places is I mean, it's often white supremacy, and it's often just, explicitly racist policy.
And I'm just going to make an intervention. You never have to be forgiven for your accent. Yeah, it's your voice, and it's fine. Yeah? I wanted to say that. Is there another? Sir. Oh,
Hi
sorry,
there.
ma'am.
My name is Erin Hern. I'm from the International Development Research Center. So we're a research granting organization based here in Ottawa. And 85 or 90% of our money goes to researchers in the Global South, many of whom are in Africa. And I'm just wondering, I haven't read the book. I've got it, though, so I've just skimmed through it. While you were researching the book and getting all these examples, did you find that the majority of the references that you were inevitably then reading were coming from northern-based researchers? So one of the things we try to do is to counter that, right? Because there are so many incredible stories of pure resilience and creativity and innovation, on and on and on, but they just don't get out because of our structural way of sharing information, especially academic information. So I'm just wondering your experience in that regard.
Yeah, so I will say that I made a point of always including authors from the countries that I was writing about. I think it's extraordinarily important in academic writing because there is such a concentration of well-cited research that's coming from North America and Europe. There is also a huge asymmetry in resources, research resources. And so a lot of what gets produced in peer-reviewed journals that are widely recognized is coming from well-resourced places. I think that is slowly starting to change, in part due to organizations like yours and academia and political science. There's starting to be more recognition that it's perhaps not a good idea to just land in a country, do research, and leave and ignore the local academic scene. So I will say that for some country cases in the book, it was much harder to find scholarship from people from those countries. And those tended to be the places that didn't have as much of a thriving university environment. So even within the continent, there are asymmetries in terms of where the research is being produced.
One of my favorite stories in your book, and it's a small little story, but I think it's indicative of what happens in Africa on a daily basis, like the everyday success stories. And it's a story that takes place in Sierra Leone. And you say, over 8 days in December 2014, 8,000 healthcare workers distributed malaria kits to 90% of the population in an Ebola-affected area, which is remarkable, right? To think of the sacrifice, to think of the resourcefulness, to think of the resilience of people, providing for their communities in that way. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, no, I agree. It's extraordinarily resourceful. And, again, this is in the public health chapter where I was focusing quite a bit on community organizations and their role with these sorts of things.
Yeah.
But I also found that utterly remarkable, particularly in the context of an Ebola epidemic, which is a terrifying time to be going door to door handing out malaria kits. So it's an extraordinary feat.
Yeah, and it speaks also to the kind of self-organization, that not all the answers are coming from the outside, they're answers on the ground. Yeah.
I think we ignore local organizing at our own peril.
Yeah. I think right over here, sir. Yeah.
Hi. First of all, I'd like to say that around the time you started writing this book, I was writing my master's thesis in comparative politics, and I read this book and I thought, oh, so that's what I was supposed to be doing. This is exactly what I wish I had written. It was a delight to read. Thank you for that. My question, I think, pertains to, and you've mentioned it a few times, I work at Global Affairs on Sub-Saharan Africa, and it really feels things are coming at us so fast, things are developing so much. You mentioned Gabon has had a coup since you wrote the book about using Gabon as a case study. Senegal's also had a lot of instability since you wrote the book. If you were to write an afterword or sort of a 2024 addition to the book, what are some points that you'd want to make? What is the latest chapter, if there was to be an eighth?
Yeah, so I think that to take those 2 points, on the Gabon case, I would say, see, I told you, it was precarious. But then what happens afterward is a big question mark. I think that part of what the update would be is thinking about the persistence of some of these, especially the policy-oriented chapters, once the person who implemented the policies has left the office. But in terms of thinking about additions, one of the things that I would want to do is add a chapter thinking about resource governance in the context of the energy transition. And I think that we're at a critical moment right now where a lot of African countries hold reserves of the minerals that are going to be required for the energy transition. And it's a critical moment because on the one hand, it could be a repeat of the scramble for Africa. And on the other hand, there's a massive opportunity for trying to harness those resources for economic development, and hopefully economic development that also includes investment in the population. So I think, we're at this pivot point right now. And so the update to the book would have a chapter on that.
And what would be some of the countries do you think you'd be looking at for that chapter?
So there are a number of countries that have a lot of these minerals. South Africa is one, Congo is one, though I'm not sure that I'd be able to paint that as a success at the moment. Zambia, there are a lot of countries in West Africa. There are a number of countries that have smaller amounts of really valuable minerals, and so thinking about how to, sort of pull a Seychelles in terms of being able to have a small industry that has a really big impact on the economy is something that would be really interesting moving forward. But I'd say that South Africa is going to be the one to watch here.
Okay. Sir.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm also the husband of Erin, so Erin this is my partner. So I want to get to the difficult part. And the difficult part for me is that what you wrote is beautiful, and thank you very much for that. But we live in a world that is contained by power relations. And the power relations that exist are not for the sake of international interest or the common good, which is exactly what you're writing about. It is, we see the rules-based international order, and how I detest that term, which is basically nothing more than the projection of national interest and hegemonic national interest on the rest of the world, and in particular in Africa. So how do you see the book or the successes you do? Because we can scream in Africa that, yes, we've achieved this despite your help. And that is the big question, isn't it? Because whenever we get an independent voice, for example, the Congress in the US just passed a bill that's going to punish South Africa for its independent position that we take as a sovereign country. I'm not saying Canada is following the same way, but Canada has been speaking now for a decade about an Africa strategy, stroke framework, stroke ... whatever they wish to call it. But yet you find that Canada's involvement in Africa is only about mining so far. Now, how will this power relationships change in order to make a real benefit, to take those successes, to take it to scale? Do you have any views on that?
I think it's an uphill battle. So some of the things that I'm working on now is thinking about how interests might align, because all actors are going to be self-interested, powerful or not, and powerful actors are always going to be able to throw their weight around and have more of a say in the rules-based international order. Right? But I think that sometimes you can create a situation where interests align in such a way that it can be mutually beneficial. And a big part of that is trying to figure out how to frame situations so as they can be mutually beneficial. And so I look at things like the recent summit held in Kenya, where the Kenyan president has been talking about Africa's role in the energy transition and advocating for, African countries to take a greater role and advocating for African countries to also be able to benefit more from this transition. And so I think that, that whether you think that he is sincere and whether you think that the type of reality he's painting is realistic, I see that as an example of a possibility where interests might align in such a way that it can be mutually beneficial. But, it's always going to be an asymmetric power game, and so it's always going to be an uphill battle.
Do you have a follow-up? Question to that? No?
One area which I'm also thinking a lot about is in the critical mineral energy space. That's in one area. Sorry, so on the follow-up, on the critical mineral energy space, if we could align there, and perhaps for the first time, not to build another OPEC, but to build, and perhaps even with the Security Council, and maybe Meredith should think about this, how we could get a global forum that seeks to develop critical minerals for the energy transition for the first time for the benefit of all, and not to re-establish power relations in countries or to make certain countries powerful. So you see, just as we gave up our nuclear power, we're willing to give up our critical mineral energy power for the sake of a better world. So perhaps that's the way.
I agree with you, and I think that this is one of the areas in which a number of African countries have considerable leverage.
Is there another question? I think there's a question. Okay, sure.
Yes, I get the impression from your talk that most of these successes were self-generated, but do you have some examples of how international assistance might have helped or played a catalytic role, or was it unhelpful in some cases?
There are some examples in which international assistance was helpful. In the chapter where I focus on gender equality and women's empowerment, the women's civil society organizations in Rwanda and Senegal were really important actors, and they were a part of transnational organizations for women's empowerment. So that was international civil society that was supporting and promoting the work that they were doing in those countries. There are, I think, in the chapter on climate, the actions undertaken by government officials in Durban and Lagos were supported by international organizations that have been focused on climate resilience. And in the public health chapter, while I focus heavily on community organizations, a lot of the funding for malaria reduction was coming from things from the United States and the UN and some of these other major public health funders. So I think there is a role for the international community, but I think one of the biggest takeaways is that the international community needs to let local actors take the lead and lean into the strengths of local communities to make sure that those interventions are effective.
Thank you. I commend you for the book you just published and the main insight that you share. I want to go, first of all, to know, because this is not a comprehensive study, and so you talk about choices, making choices. And so do you see the need to make a comprehensive account of the successes that the world should know? Because the one thing that we need to know is to change the story we've been telling about Africa. Mm-hmm. That you said of misery and poverty. And so just selecting things from your perspective, and if it is not really a criteria that would try to canvas all the successes that people can now get the picture and take also the point that the people from RDC mentioned, to include the insight from native researchers who have done, who can tell the story from the African perspective. That this work is to me is titillating my hunger and to make a real difference. So I would like to see if you are willing to follow up with that and make a more comprehensive study of that. Yeah.
No, yeah, okay.
So the second point is really important, and that's for the next part, I think, because you mentioned things that you mentioned the coup happening in Africa, and you mentioned the recent coup happening in Africa, and this is not just Gabon. That's what she mentioned, but that's the point, you know. And I think that's a part that need to be covered. And it's related to governance, that people want to choose a different way of governing. So if you talk about that, I want to focus some attention to what's happening in Sahel. So you've got Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And so they started a new movement that with a new government. It's a coup, but it was brought up by the population. That this is an element that is, if we don't understand that, we're going to stay with the same social attitude that would keep us just making in France we say sur place. We're not really understanding what Africa need to really prevent the future, the next scramble for Africa, but to let us now take the predominant role in who we want to become and who are our partner, instead of being always the subject of dominance foreign forces. So the Sahel need to be given an importance of the government that is taken. It's military people, but the people from those countries support that. They are being actually now influenced to follow what the West has always dictated them. So those countries have understood that they need to change that relationship with the West, and they need to be on top of what they chose and free to choose the way they want to get free from neocolonialism.
Yeah, I mean, the political upheavals that have been going on in West and Central Africa with the spate of coups it's a huge reprimand of the West generally, France in particular, and I think it poses a really interesting question about what model of governance is going to be best, and what's going to happen next. And I know and a lot of people who are sort of waiting with bated breath to see what develops out of those situations. But you're right, it is critically important. Conflict and coups were not something that I focused on in this book. I think having, an encyclopedia of successes is a great idea. It would be a much, much longer book. A publisher would not have been happy about that. But, I think you bring up an important point, and I say at the beginning of the book, it's not intended to be a comprehensive account of these things, but it is an excellent idea to try to think about these things in a more comprehensive way. So I'll take that under consideration and see what appetite my editor has for, several thousand-page volume.
There's a question here. Oh, no. Okay. Yes.
I have some questions that have coming online. I'll just read through a few of them, and if I need to reiterate, that's fine. So the first question that we got online was asking, what do you make of Morton Jervin's critiques of the availability and comprehensiveness of reliable data? So especially looking at economic data. And then the other two questions are a bit more seeking your input as well. The next question is asking, what questions or areas of research would you suggest students look into today? And then finally, someone says, thank you for your insightful talk. In your travels, did you see active efforts towards less dependence on NGOs in the more successful countries you highlighted? And I can reiterate any of them at any point.
Okay, thank you for those. So I'll start with the question of data. This is a really important question. So in the book, I rely on cross-national data sets to sort of select which countries are doing better. And there's been a lot of work suggesting that some of these indicators are based on estimates that are likely to be incorrect a lot of the time. Right? So from a methodological perspective, part of my question as I'm looking at these data sets is the bias likely to always be in the same direction for the countries that I'm looking at? So in other words, even if I don't buy the number of GDP per capita for a country like Gabon, do I think that I can use one index to compare Gabon and Equatorial Guinea? Right. And if the indicator is all biased in the same direction, you can still use it to do comparisons, even if you think that the underlying data is not entirely accurate. So I think that is a very important question, and it's an important critique for doing broad comparative work. It's something that you need to think about when you're thinking about what you are comparing when you're looking at these numbers. I do think that even with acknowledging the limitations of some of these indices, that it's still useful for thinking about how countries perform related to each other. In terms of what students should study now, totally biased opinion is that the two most important things that we're facing right now are climate change and democratic erosion. And so I think that those are going to continue to be really major challenges globally for the next decade, and fruitful areas of inquiry in terms of how we can halt or reverse democratic erosion and how we can stem the effects of climate change. And I'm sorry, could you repeat the third question?
Yes, so the last question is asking, in your travels, did you see active efforts towards less dependence on NGOs in the successful countries you highlighted?
Okay, so to answer that question, I would need to rely on travels that I did previously. In some of the previous work that I did focus a bit on service delivery and look at the role of NGOs and things like that. And so one of the questions that I had in some of my earlier work is how people perceive NGO presence. Do people perceive NGO presence as indicating a failure of the state? Or do they see NGO presence as sort of being part and parcel of what the state is doing? In some of the work that I did in Zambia, what I heard from people quite frequently is that needing to get services from an NGO was indicative of a failure of the state. And part of the risk there is that people might then start to withdraw in terms of engaging politically with the state might start to lose legitimacy. So this is sort of a roundabout way of answering this question. I think that states that have a better economic capacity and better infrastructure don't have to rely on NGOs as much. So there's maybe a spurious correlation that countries that are doing better rely less on NGOs because they don't require as much input from NGOs to meet basic needs. But I think one thing that's important to consider is in places where NGO efforts are still really important for people meeting their basic needs, how do you do that in such a way that you're not also eroding legitimacy of the state?
Are there any other questions or comments? I'm just going to go here first. Sir.
Thank you. I wish also to join the others to congratulate you for this excellent book. I haven't read it yet, but I'm planning to. I just have a question. When you were doing sampling of questions that you found that you presented to be able to get countries that are performing well in Africa, I want to know whether you also looked at the role of the youth. You spoke about women. But as you know that today in Africa, most of the countries, the youth population is over 60%. For the whole continent of 1.5 billion people, the youth between the age of 15 and 35 form 65% of the population. And there is a lot of innovation within them. They're educated, they're innovating, and therefore they have a role in the economic development of these countries, as well as politically. A recent example of Senegal, the people who elected the president, or the majority who voted for the president, the current president, are the youth. So I don't know whether you did look at this one as a contributing factor for some of the success stories. Of course, the others are policy changes, as the gentleman here highlighted, getting out of that nostalgia of policies that were holding back the continent. So the youth are sick and tired of that. They want new ideas that will propel them, because they're thinking about a better future for themselves and their offsprings. They want to see a better Africa, you know, whereby you don't have to see people crossing the Mediterranean or any other ocean to go and look for a better life. Yeah, so I don't know whether you did look at that.
It wasn't something that I looked at specifically. It is something that I have certainly heard in some of the other work that I've done. In Zambia, they refer to the politicians as the hippopotamus generation. Right? So there's definitely like a sense of disdain that, you know, the majority of the population is young, but a lot of the politicians are the same guys from the 1960s and 70s. And so there's a disconnect between what's going on in politics and what's going on in the rest of the country. So I have not worked on that specifically. I do have a student who is working on those types of issues and looking at African agency and entrepreneurial communities in particular. So as he starts to write things, I would be happy to share those, but that's something that he has been focusing on.
Just wondering, just a time check, just wondering how much time we have. We're almost wrapping up. A quick question. Did you have a question, sir, very, very quickly? Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned that the Congo is going to be in your focus in the future, if you think. And I think it's one of the major issues, the situation that is happening in the Congo. It's not that women are not being empowered or not. It is a kind of global forces against the Congo as a country with all those resources. So people are, the Western world want the Balkanization of the Congo, where even neighboring countries that we are proud of the evolution of that they are benefiting, but it's at the expense of what the suffering of people from the Congo that over decades that have been asserted in the United Nations, but it has not gotten the resonance that we require to make the change that we want. So if we continue with that view of closing our eyes and on those aspects of what happening, it's really in a central country, rich and with people and people dying. It's a genocide that has not been talked about. And to me, I don't know how we can just continue to how do you say, to claim or applaud the success of neighboring country, knowing that is at the expenses of what's the suffering of the other country. We have to deal with those issues. So every country, and the Congo and the neighboring country benefit from the resources. And most of Canada, the United States are responsible for what's happening there. Mm-hmm. Is that something that needs to be tackled or not?
Does the situation in Congo need to be tackled? I mean, you know, what's going on in the Congo right now is it's a horrific human tragedy, and horrific human tragedy describes a lot of what has been going on in the Congo since King Leopold showed up, you know? So, like, I don't think there are easy solutions. I think even if tomorrow the international community woke up and said, we need to fix what's happening in the Congo, like, that wouldn't necessarily solve anything. I think, you know, so part of what you're referencing is, of course, Rwanda is complicit in what's going on in Congo right now. Yes, yes. And so, I think then that begs the question, so should we talk about success in a country like Rwanda while it's also complicit in what's going on in Congo? And this is a really complicated question. I mentioned when we started talking about Rwanda that Paul Kagame is a controversial leader. I think he has done some things that are good and he's done some things that are very bad. I think the risk is that if we can only talk about unadulterated successes, we will run out of positive things to talk about. Yeah, I think yes. In terms of the Congo? Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you. It's unfathomable to me that there's not more attention being paid to this particular situation. But I think that it is also important to be able to acknowledge that positive things happen alongside of catastrophes and to not only focus on catastrophe.
Hern, I think it's time for us to acknowledge, how good this book is. Thank you so much for writing it, and I think you've really inspired, you provoked, a lot of thoughtful comments today, and we have more questions for you for your next book. Thanks so much. Thanks for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it remains to me for me to simply offer some final reflections and mostly words of thanks. I want to thank, first of all, Global Affairs Canada, who have been our longtime collaborators in convening discussions such as this. I want to thank all those who have joined us online, actually a very large audience that's joined us online today. So thank you for joining us from wherever in the world that you are doing that, and for your thoughtful questions. And of course, for all of those who have joined us here in person, despite the vagaries of spring in Ottawa, thank you for being part of this effort. But let me thank especially Professor Harewood and Professor Hern for taking us through this extraordinary journey. Adrian, you've been such a great addition to the portfolio of people we're happy to invite on this stage, and this is not the first time you've been a thoughtful and insightful host, thinking about complicated and important issues. So thank you. It's a real gift, and we're very, very blessed to have you in our community. Thank you, Adrian. And Professor Hern, you really have done us a great service by helping to complicate our pictures of the world, yet again reminding us that simple and sloganeering views of what's going on in this complicated world can almost always be dismissed as unhelpful. You've helped us understand what's going on top down, but also bottom up. You've helped us understand how the differences inside the continent are almost as interesting, maybe more interesting than the differences between what's going on in Africa and what's happening in other parts of the world. You've helped us understand this most recent exchange, that maybe perfection is too high a bar for us to hold any entity in this world to, and that even the successes we might expect in places that are much closer to home are always caveated by all kinds of difficulties and failures. These are the complex realities in which we live. So for introducing such dimensionality to our understanding of what's happening today in Africa, and by extension what's happening to us in our world today, we are very, very much in your debt. I very much commend the book to all of you if you have not seen it, Explaining Successes in Africa. Things don't always fall apart. Erin Hern at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. Please read it, enjoy it. If you're not on our events list, please get on our events list, because this is of a piece of events we try to convene here on an ongoing basis. So thank you all for being with us this evening. And let me ask Uju to conclude us for the night. Uju.
Thank you, Khalil. Thank you once again, Adrian and Erin, for the conversation today, and thank you to everyone, rather I should say, who has stayed engaged in today's conversation, asking questions, and feel free to, catch the speakers before they have to leave momentarily after once we're done. I'd like to use this opportunity to invite everyone to give a bit of feedback on how today's session went. And this time around, we're going to do it a bit differently. I'm actually going to pause and give us time to start our reflections here in the room. And also, if you're joining us online, we'd also love to hear from you. Please scan the QR code if you're able to, or use the link that will be provided in the chat. We really love to get your perspective, especially for our events like this on Global Reads. We'd also like to get your recommendations on other books that you have come across that you think would be worth discussing, and even recommending discussants as well. We would love to hear from you in that capacity. And then also within the feedback survey, we also have a bit of reflection questions in there as well. We've had a lot of discussions today, but just thinking about everything that has been said, what is a personal commitment or takeaway, or a professional one as well, that you're taking with you from today's conversation? Maybe it's learning more, maybe it's asking more questions, whatever that may look like for you in your own sphere of influence. So again, if you sat down, there's a QR code on your seat, or you can look at the 3 screens around the room to be able to scan that as well. So I'll just give a bit of a pause, and I can invite Erin and Adrian to take your seats, and thank you once again. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just reiterating what Khalil mentioned earlier, that if you're not already part of our events mailing list, please, as it says on the screen, subscribe to our newsletter. You can specifically select that you're interested in events. If you're having any issues with that, or you have any further questions, please feel free to speak to me as well. And I want to say thank you once again, and have a very good evening.